I mean, you talk about the sexual violence of that day, the claims that have been made, the evidence of it. Can you give us? I mean, the documentary does, of course, but for the benefit of people watching, can you give us an idea of what you discovered happened on that day, and was mass sexual violence used by Hamas as a weapon? This is certainly very much the narrative that came out in much of the media at the time.
I mean, the basic answer is no. There simply is not the evidence or anything approaching sufficient evidence to suggest that sexual violence was systematic and widespread and deliberate and instrumentalized and weaponized. You would expect far more evidence than that. Now, whether isolated incidents of rape occurred, we just don't know. It's possible, rape very commonly does occur in situations of war, and you certainly can't rule that out.
Yes, I mean, we have seen video, I think, of, I mean, I've certainly seen video of young women being dragged and treated appallingly and thrown into the back of trucks and things like that. But of course, beyond that, we have to hear the reports of others. But essentially, what you're saying is that there is actually no established evidence that the Israelis have acted. Have the Israelis provided any evidence?
None at all. Well, essentially, if you actually look at the reporting in things like the BBC, the Guardian, and the New York Times, it's quite clear they're getting all their reporting from Israeli officials, IDF officials, and first responders. The big significance of the baby story is that we know all those stories are untrue, and they were all coming from Israeli officials, the IDF, and first responders. And if those sources have proved extremely unreliable in that story, then common sense is they're going to be unreliable in other stories. So you look for other evidence, and the visual evidence just isn't there. Yes, there is footage of young Israeli women being taken hostage. Yes, but that's not evidence of rape. I think people can rather fill in they rather fill in the gaps in their imagination, but that's nothing like, that doesn't even approach evidence. The 7 hours of footage I watched from the day, there's no sexual violence occurs. Dreadful things happen in it, but there isn't any sexual violence in that footage. Post-mortem, the films and the photographs taken after the event. No, again, I mean, yes, you see dead people with lots of blood on them, but that's not evidence of rape. I mean, if we take one case study, one image that I took very, very seriously, there was a young woman. She was killed, shot 9 miles north of the music festival site as she was escaping very early in the morning, about 7 in the morning. And this was the centerpiece of the New York Times story. Their big screams without words story. And about a third of the article consisted of this. And almost immediately it had come out, the woman's family or her sister spoke out, said, hang on, this isn't true. And when we spoke to the New York Times about this, they didn't tell us this was a story about sexual violence. We know she wasn't raped because she was texting us almost up to the moment of her death. Her husband, who was with her, spoke to his brother for 44 minutes immediately afterwards, and didn't mention a rape. We know she wasn't raped. So that, in a way, was the most powerful image. That was the centerpiece of one of the biggest investigations the New York Times into this, and it collapsed almost immediately. So there just isn't. For example, the Israelis will talk a lot about how you have bodies of young women tied to posts, tied to trees, with the lower part of their clothing removed. But again, not a single image to support this. Now, Zaka, who were responsible for collecting bodies, will say, well, we weren't told to take photos. It's not what we're trained in, and so on, which might be true. But there's not a single image to support this. And there are thousands of images of the immediate aftermath. And I mean, another example, you will see first responders, people who worked in the morgues, who will talk again and again about the sexual mutilation of corpses. Now, the somewhat dubious UN report, which came out about 3 weeks ago, garnered the headlines that I think the Israelis wanted. If you actually read it, there's some serious professional work that has gone on there. And one of the things they say is we could see no evidence for a pattern of sexual mutilation of corpses at all. So basically, we can go on to the issue of witnesses as well, of whom there are remarkably few, and there's certainly no victims, possibly because they're dead. I mean, of course. But and this is the point we make in the film. Yes, perhaps there were isolated instances of rape, but if it was systematic and widespread, you would have some evidence. You'd have some evidence.